Perez was dominant on street circuits once again and secured the win despite his teammate trying to close the gap towards the end of the Grand Prix in Saudi Arabia. It was a great result for Red Bull and a good start to the season with two different winners from two races in 2023. There's a lot to talk about further down the order, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. The Red Bull dominance continues. The Red Bull has looked dominant in Saudi Arabia just as they did in Bahrain, but there has been a sign that the team may have some reliability concerns after Verstappen failed to set a time in Q2 and ended up down in 15th on the grid. But despite that poor qualifying position, the Dutch world champion started the race as favourite for the win, which is a staggering fact when you consider the Jeddah Corniche circuit is narrow and overtaking isn't quite as easy as it is at other circuits like Spa, when Verstappen won from 14th place last season. This shows the dominance of the Red Bull, but also shows how strong Verstappen is compared to his teammate, according to the bookies. In the race, Verstappen was sensibly cautious early on, making progress once DRS was activated after lap 3. From there, he dominated the midfield cars when it came to straight line speed, and this allowed him to be in a great position once the safety car came out and he got the cheap pit stop from there. With the bunched up field, Verstappen made light work of the Mercedes of Russell and the Aston Martin of Alonso, and was then starting to chase down his teammate for the win. The Red Bull's pace for the last 30 laps was quite impressive. The pair disappeared off into the distance, setting lap times that were about a second faster than every other car in the order. What I found particularly interesting about this pace was the fact that the team had clearly not turned down their engines as they did in Bahrain. When they were in the positions of first and second, with Verstappen winning from Perez, the team did seem to turn their engines down and coasted to the finish line in Bahrain, limiting their ability to build such a big gap to the other teams. This was perhaps a tactical decision, making sure they don't show the full potential of their car, which might mean the rule makers would want to change regulations to try and close up the championship battle going into 2024 and beyond. Interestingly, in this situation with Verstappen behind his teammate, the team had clearly given more power, and as such they continued to disappear off into the distance from the other teams. There were potential gremlins exposing themselves towards the end of the race, with Verstappen clearly quite upset about a different sound he was hearing at high speed. It sounded like the team weren't really able to see any particular problems in the data, but even with the confidence from the team to Verstappen, Perez was the driver that had built a huge lead in the race and Max simply couldn't catch him. Perez does tend to be very strong around street circuits, and his strength continued to be on display in Saudi Arabia. And it's great that the team didn't impose team orders this early on in the 2023 season. It's now 1 win apiece and 1 point in it between the two Red Bull drivers, and it's good to see that they're keeping it competitive with another strong 1-2 for the team. It may have taken Verstappen to start well down the order, but the Red Bull team are clearly proving their dominance this year. So it's a green box for Red Bull, and it's particularly exciting to see a different winner already this season. Second in the Constructors' Championship looks incredibly close. While Red Bull is the clear number 1 team on the grid this year, the season so far suggests that the 3 teams behind them in the order are incredibly close. In Bahrain, Ferrari were probably the second fastest team, but they were fragile when it came to reliability. Aston Martin were probably the third quickest as they were able to beat the Mercedes drivers in the race pace. And then Mercedes looked to be the 4th fastest team in what looked like a disappointing performance from the team that showed they'd lost out to their rivals over the winter break. In Saudi Arabia, these 3 teams were incredibly close once again. The qualifying results saw Alonso second on the grid, Russell third and Sainz fourth, with their teammates in various positions behind. So there was no clear team seizing that second place, and even if Red Bull continued to dominate at the front, there will be some excellent racing in the fight for that final podium spot. In the race itself, once the safety car period was over for Stroll's Aston Martin, the remaining 5 drivers from these 3 teams were incredibly close on track. Mercedes had gone with the alternate strategy for Hamilton, which meant they could be in the fight for a podium spot with both drivers, having benefited compared to the Ferraris with cheap pit stops. If the fight between these 3 teams keeps going this season, then I think there'll be a lot of interesting fights throughout the 2023 season. Today, the Ferrari team did make an error when it came to strategy once again. Admittedly, it's unfortunate that they had stopped both cars before the safety car window, but it was already clear that the overcut was the better option and they should have been factoring in the likelihood of a safety car when it comes to making their pit stop calls. Either way, there are 3 teams fighting for second in this championship, and that is deserving of a green box. To learn more about how this battle develops, you should make sure you subscribe to Behind the Drive for the latest information. Mercedes show their potential. As I mentioned before, Mercedes had a poor showing in Bahrain, and they were very critical of their own performance considering it was the second year in a row that they'd failed to produce a car that was capable of competing with the top teams. This weekend, it felt they were more in the mix, particularly being ahead of the Ferrari cars. George Russell's third place on the grid was a good achievement as he benefited from Verstappen's reliability issue and Leclerc's grid drop, but he proved that there is pace in that car in certain environments. In the race, the team went for the counter strategy with Hamilton, starting the driver on hard tyres to go onto the mediums after the pit stops, and I think there was a chance that they could have let him go ahead of Russell to attack Alonso during that final stint, but they had done enough to ensure both Mercedes cars finish ahead of the Ferraris, and they took 4th and 5th across the line. To add, it seems like they were the team that contested the serving of the penalty Alonso received for being out of position at the start of the race, considering the rear jack touched the car before the penalty was served. Something that Esteban Ocon received a 10-second penalty for in Bahrain. Once that same consistent penalty was applied, Mercedes took 3rd and 5th, which meant they went from being joint second in the Constructors' Championship to now being a lone second. Last season, one of their strongest points was their reliability, and it seems like that's continuing this season when you look at the fact that Ferrari, Aston Martin and Red Bull have all shown signs of problems after the first 2 rounds. There's already talk of the Mercedes team identifying huge gains from a change in aerodynamic direction based on their early experiments. If they're able to bring this to the car quickly, they could well be able to develop faster than those other teams in this fight. Right now, the battle for second in this championship is wide open, and while Aston Martin seem to be the second fastest on track, particularly with Alonso, it's the Mercedes consistency that's keeping them in it, as well as their willingness to put these kinds of challenges to the FIA to ensure their rivals are penalised. So for me, it's a green box for Mercedes' improvement from the first race to the second, and for their potential this season. Alpine state their claim for 5th. The fight for 5th in this championship remains wide open in my opinion. After Bahrain, I think there were reasonable claims for every team outside of the top 4 to be in with a shout of that position, even with McLaren's dreadful performance in the Bahrain race. However, this weekend in Saudi Arabia, I think that Alpine have been the first team in that fight to put in consistent performances over the course of a weekend that may mean that they can be the favourite for that best of the rest position. Throughout the weekend, the Alpines were well in the mix of the top 10, and they took advantage of this strong car as they ended up 6th and 9th on the grid, and managed to take the 2 spots behind the top 4 teams in the race as well. This season, with 4 teams that are significantly faster than the others, there's going to be less points on offer for the rest of the teams. 9th and 10th offered 2 and 1 points respectively, and whenever a driver from those top 4 teams have issues, as Stroll faced today, there are 4 points on offer for 8th position. These points will be critical, and the fact that they've taken 6 today to add to their 2 from Bahrain means they're now in that 5th position in the Constructors' Championship. It's critical that these teams take advantage of the opportunities that they have whenever they are the best of the rest, and right now it seems that Alpine are well in the mix, so it's a green box for their performance this weekend. From bad to worse for McLaren. McLaren had an abysmal start to their 2023 campaign in Bahrain, but in Saudi Arabia there were again some signs that they had some pace in their car. Oscar Piastri put in an excellent performance in his second career qualifying to get the McLaren into the top 10 shootout. Meanwhile, his more experienced teammate Lando Norris made a critical error, hitting the barrier in Q1, which meant he could only get 19th on the grid at a circuit where it may have been tricky to make overtakes stick. Once they were in the race, it took just 1 lap for everything to fall apart. In efforts to look after his car through the first few corners, Piastri ended up in a wrong place at the wrong time and found himself in a closing gap between Pierre Gasly and the wall. This meant that he lost his front wing end plate and was forced into an early stop for repairs. Lando Norris also ended up in the pits after he sustained front wing damage, and this resulted in the pair finding themselves at the back of the order from the off. And so all of a sudden, the team had failed to capitalise on the promising qualifying result for the Australian driver. From that point onwards, the team had a compromised strategy. This performance summarised just how bad their season is looking. It seems like the midfield is very competitive and there is a chance that they could catch up, particularly with a new car design, which may arrive in the next few races. But for now, the team's warning from their car launch has clearly materialised in the first races of the year. The team's drivers were in a fight with the Williams of Logan Sargent towards the end of the race, and it was really a race over nothing when they were fighting for 15th position. The team have fallen an awful long way when you compare themselves to last season, and so it's clearly a red box for McLaren, and as I've said in a recent video, they need to start showing signs of improvements or other teams may come in for their most experienced driver in Lando Norris. Honourable mentions. There aren't too many honourable mentions today, but I think it was great to see Kevin Magnussen manage to overtake Yuki Tsunoda to secure the final point. There are now just 2 teams without points on the board, with those being McLaren and AlphaTauri. So regardless of who won that battle, there would have been just 2 teams without points so far this season. It feels like every team is capable of securing points this year, and it will be interesting to see just how competitive this season will be outside of those top 4 teams. So the second round of the season is over, and we have a close battle for second in the Constructors' Championship, and maybe even a battle for the Drivers' Championship right now. But what did I miss from the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix? Make sure to let me know that in the comments.